G'day everyone, my name is Mark Bachmann and I'm the Managing Director of Nature Glenelg Trust, a not-for-profit organisation that works across southeastern Australia, and we've been particularly active over the past decade in working with communities to restore wetlands, which is the subject of today's discussion. One site that we'll be talking about in detail is a wetland called Long Swamp in Discovery Bay Coastal Park, which is now part of one of Australia's most recent Ramsar sites, quite nearby to the Glenelg River. To set the scene for the discussion today, I thought I'd show you a photo of an area of habitat in Long Swamp and get you to reflect on what you see. The reason for this will become apparent as we get a little bit further along in the talk, but do you see an area that looks completely intact? Do you see an area that might be changing? It's an interesting thing to reflect on in terms of what you see when you go and look at a site and whether you're actually clear on whether there is a trajectory of change occurring at a site. In terms of where Long Swamp is situated, as I mentioned before, it's actually near the mouth of the Glenelg River and right near the border that separates South Australia and Victoria, right in the far southwestern corner of Victoria. Interestingly, at this site there's what we reflect on as being early conflicting evidence of artificial drainage. So some years ago, a local elderly lady whose father owned a farm adjacent to Long Swamp recounted how she had seen the site change and she'd seen the effect of an artificial cutting made at a place called Noble's Rocks. Interestingly, when you go digging back through the old records, the very earliest, one of the very earliest maps of this area actually shows an outlet to the sea at Noble's Rocks in 1850, and an area of fresh water behind that outlet which doesn't exist or didn't exist in the modern era. And so there's these sort of confounding and conflicting stories of change and of history at this site that didn't really mesh together or make sense. And over a course of the best part of the last decade, we've been able to piece together that history of change. One of the things that we've noticed at that location where that area of fresh water was marked in 1850 is that not only has the wetland vegetation clearly changed, but there's even encroachment of coastal dune species, in this case coastal wattle, into the wetland bed. So consistent with the image that I was showing you earlier and thinking about trajectory of change, this is a really obvious symptom and sign of a drying trend when you see coastal dryland species actually invading areas of wetland. One of several tools we use to help piece together a trajectory of change at a site is the aerial photographic record, and at Long Swamp the earliest aerial photography was flown in 1950. You can see here particularly keep your eye on the areas mapped blue and red, which show the aquatic and semi-aquatic areas, and how they change when we fast forward to more recent aerial photography. The shrinking of those habitat types is quite clear from the aerial photographic record, which indicates that there is a trajectory of change going on. Other evidence that has emerged to support the account I showed you earlier, which suggested a mid-1930s cutting being made at Noble's Rocks, includes some newspaper articles from the 1950s, which very much tell the story of a recent cutting and the attempts of an angling club at the time who were concerned about the impact of the loss of freshwater flows on the Glenelg River mouth and estuary on fishing. So they actually attempted to reverse those changes unsuccessfully. Based on the available information, we were actually comfortable at this point to progress with a trial to attempt to reverse this trajectory of change and the drying trend that the local community had certainly been witnessing and that we could see was having an effect on the distribution of habitats in the area. Despite the fact that we hadn't yet pieced together the whole story, it was clear that the site really needed remedial action to reverse or at least halt that trajectory of change. So the trial actually progressed in 3 phases, but the one that we'll focus on today is the final phase and where the majority of works occurred. This is I guess, a gradual unfolding of the construction of the phase 3 trial structure, which you can see was, it took a lot of volunteer and community help. It's constructed of about 7,000 sandbags, took about 10 or 12 days spread out over 2 or 3 months to construct, and as water levels rose that winter, you can see the dramatic transformation and the additional water being held up behind the structure. One of the interesting things you'll note here is that the initial levels we set, and because of the effect of vegetation concealing true surface level, we weren't 100% sure what level to set this at to get the desired effect, and we were seeking to reinstate flows back towards the Glenelg River. As you'll see here, we had a small flow trickling over the top, so we literally topped the structure with a couple more layers of sandbags, and this was how it stayed for the subsequent few years. All the while, and while we were doing this work, and there's a whole lot of other things I haven't told you about that led to that work, including monitoring that we're doing of aquatic species and vegetation and the like, but all the while there was an interesting piece of sideline work I was doing, trying to understand and piece together the history of change at the site to understand exactly why we had these conflicting accounts. And it meant going and exploring a whole range of different sources, perhaps your non-traditional sources for someone who's trained in science, like most of us are who work in this field, but very interesting nonetheless. So looking at old maps, and you'll see some examples there of how this area had variously been shown in maps over the years. Newspaper articles, journals, oral accounts, the list goes on. There's a wide range of materials that we can use to pull together, and particularly when you're trying to understand what's happened at a site prior to the photographic record, in this case pre-1950, there's really no other choice if you're trying to understand the changes that have occurred at a site than to go looking through these other sources of information and trying to triangulate to use them to work out what has actually gone on and come up with what we hope is as close as possible an accurate version of the truth. And in terms of a starting point for this story, we're fortunate that after some digging, it turns out that surveyor Charles Tyers, who'd been sent by the government of New South Wales at the time to mark the location of the boundary between the colony of New South Wales, this is prior to Victoria existing, and the new colony of South Australia, he was sent along this section of coast and actually made observations the whole way along about what he was seeing. He was very interested in the productive capacity of the land and the presence of fresh water, and it is of note that considering that he marked waterways and flow paths in other locations the whole way along the coast and made reference to them in his notes, that he didn't notice or note any outlet to the sea at Nobles Rocks, despite the fact that he walked this section of coast, and we know that based on his observations of the path that he took. So this is a really helpful starting point for the story, because it gives us confidence that prior to European colonisation, there was no outlet to the sea at Nobles Rocks. So as far as a bookend to the story, that's a really helpful place to start. But how did things change from there? Now, the image I showed you on the previous slide, I should point out, is actually one that I've just modified to illustrate the point that there was no outlet there. That is based on this image, which is the original drawing made by Surveyor Lindsay Clark in 1850, which clearly does show an outlet to the sea at Nobles Rocks, which is fascinating, and also an area of open water behind that outlet, which clearly indicates that this drain was not operating in any way like its modern equivalent, because this area was not holding water in the modern era. We know that this was likely opened by squatters, as this area was part of a pastoral run at the time, and cutting drains where you could get water flowing to take water off land to reduce its inundation and improve the productive potential of that land for grazing was a common thing that was done from the very earliest days of European settlement. So that's the likely explanation for this flow path. And then fast forward to around the turn of the century, in the late 1890s, when Australia was in the grip of one of its worst droughts. And in fact, looking at the old rainfall records, this area had its period of consecutive years of lowest rainfall on record during that era, which possibly helps to explain the natural closure of the previously observed outlet. And this was corroborated by some early accounts that were recorded by a previous Fisheries and Wildlife Officer, Gavin Serini, who was investigating the history of this area at the time, and really dovetailed neatly in that the oldest of the people he interviewed remembered it when there was still an outlet prior to the turn of the century, and the slightly younger elderly people remembered it only being closed and with a water body behind it. Now, that water body was named in a number of accounts as Bully Lake, which is named after an early traditional owner. It stayed this way until the 1930s, when the account of the elderly lady I mentioned earlier, Edna Milhouse, falls into the sequence of events really neatly in terms of a new cutting being made at that time. And so the drain then continued to flow for a few decades from the mid-1930s after being artificially opened, and despite attempts to close it in the 1950s, this was the period in which the memory of the open water body at Nobles Rocks Bully Lake was lost from local memory. And the 1970s was a busy period. Gavin Serini and the department at the time were involved in a couple of closures, first in 1971 and then a later closure in 1972. The second one of those lasted for a couple of years, but it failed again, and there's conjecture as to whether that was caused by sabotage or just high seas and erosion. But the net effect of that is basically between 1975 and when Nature Glenelg Trust became involved in 2014, the drain outlet was again flowing. And it was at that point that our work came in and fits into this sequence of events, with initially regulating the flow and then completely closing the flow with the trial structure you were shown earlier from 2015. And so fast forward through that period, and we do have a good photographic record of what occurred. You can see the outlet when it was flowing with just the early phase trial structures in 2014 and the wetland behind it. And if we fast forward, you'll see the effect of the phase 3 trial structure and the recreation of Bully Lake at Nobles Rocks, which was really fantastic to witness. Fast forward another year and you can see the gradual change in conditions, and another couple of years, and the whole system is adjusting to the new hydrological regime, which is something that naturally occurs in wetlands in response to changing seasonal conditions and climatic trends over time. And so as a result of everything that's come to this point, in 2019, we're actually able to take the confidence we have in the history of the site and seek funding to reinstate the original sand dune at the location of the trial structure, which is now buried. And over the subsequent slides, you'll see how our objective is to return an area to effectively its original condition, which has been extremely effective in this instance. As well as being with us every step of the way and providing information, the local community have been a fantastic practical help with this project. If you'd like to learn more about community involvement in our projects, I'm actually giving a talk on that subject tomorrow afternoon in concurrent session 9B. And this overall summary is just to give you a sense of how much of the wetland system has been influenced by the project. Upstream of the trial structure, bearing in mind that flows go from right to left towards the river, little to no influence. A significant influence at the site of the trial structure and works that have occurred there. And downstream, we have this area of a chain of wetlands within the Ramsar site, 11 kilometres of wetlands, which have benefited from the increase in flows through and also to the wetland hydrology of those wetlands in that zone, which we've noticed having a positive impact on a wide range of hydrological and biological parameters. And so to take you back to the earlier view that we were looking at of wetland habitat in the vicinity of Nobles Rocks at the beginning of the talk, this is to show you the change in vegetation that has occurred as a result of reinstating something more closely approaching the original hydrological regime. So you were seeing an image with a lot of invading shrubs, which, as you'll see, as the trial structure took effect, initially looked quite sick, and then a couple of years later, this is exactly the same view. We have a complete transformation in the species that are present here and the distribution. So the shrubs have moved back out, which is a reversal of that process of terrestrialization that was spoken about. That's it for me. Thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to get in touch about our wetland restoration work, my contact details are there. Thank you very much.